Professors of Reddit, who was the dumbest or stupidest student you ever had, and what was so dumb about them? A student in my economics class started his final essay with this. We are all familiar with the country Africa, yet at the same time, we know little about them. All we know is that it is hot there, African Americans live there, and they are really poor. This begs the question, why is Africa that poor? It was just so jam-packed with stupid, I had to stop grading for 24 hours. For the record, this was indeed a college student. Story 2. My wife teaches public speaking. The first speech in that class is just a simple narrative speech. Tell a story from your life. She had a freshman tell the class about a time he helped his boss in high school kidnap the boss's child after he had lost a custody battle. The student clearly thought the story would make him look cool and badass. Everyone in the class was horrified. Story 3. Happened in the first week of a college anthropology course. Prof. Let's list a few basic differences between modern humans and animals, student. We have a heartbeat. Story 4. I didn't believe any student was dumb. She may only have needed the right motivation. Until I met RJ, RJ was dumb. RJ didn't realize that the chicken we eat was the same as the animal. RJ was 21 at the time. Story 5. As a gay teaching freshman English, I had a couple instances of cheating that left me speechless. First, my university uses an online plagiarism checker, and the students know this. With one student, over half of his essay was copied from a website. He looked genuinely shocked when I called him out on it, and then told me that his mother wrote the paper for him. I explained that his mother writing his paper was also cheating. Then he asked if he could get CR for the half that wasn't from a website. Another time, the students had to analyze a movie showing how it used the hero's journey as plot structure. This was an easy assignment, seeing as how nearly every modern movie uses this structure. The student copied the Wikipedia summary of Prawn Aladdin Prawn, word for word, and he denied doing it. He argued it was a coincidence that his entire essay was the exact same as Wikipedia's. Story 6. I had a student who wrote an art history paper about Leonard da Vinci. Didn't even run that sucker through a spell check or anything. Referred to him as that throughout the entire paper. Prawn thanks to everyone who pointed out that I couldn't spell in my post about spelling things wrong. Story 7. One of my students told me he was going to be 21 when he graduated high school. I asked him why. He explained that he ages 2 years every year. He is 15 turning 16, so that is 2 years. He is probably right that he will not graduate HS till age 21, but not for the reason he mentioned. Story 8. One of my husband's colleagues said a kid came up to him after an exam and said, "I didn't know the answers to the questions you asked on the test, so I made up my own questions and answered them." The professor said, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And when I go to lunch, I'm going to tell all my friends." Story 9. I had a student plagiarize on the final exam. It was a take-home essay short answer exam. They knew to cite any sources and to put it in their own words. The kicker? This particularly bright bulb plagiarized me, the professor. She tried to pass off my words as her own. Well, this is by a factor of a whole bunch. I'm a qualitative researcher. Numbers are not my jam. My most upvoted comment, to address a few common questions. 1. This student copied directly off of class materials I had provided and given no other analysis or work at all. They did not cite their work either. I'd instructed them to cite everything and even given them examples of how to cite the materials I gave them. And, more to the point, they did not show me they understood the material. They showed me they could copy-paste. I was teaching educational psychology, and it was important that they show me their understanding. 2. They did not fail the course. For this reason, I do not recall their final grade. I tossed it up to my department head, and we decided they would not get any CR for the questions they copied, but everything else would be graded normally. I then wrote them a long email explaining why what they did was not acceptable and to not do it again. 3. To the one who told me to eat a D. My husband quite enjoyed it the other night when I did so. So, insult failed? Story 10. I didn't have any particularly dumb student, also not a professor, but a graduate teaching assistant. But I did mark one essay that began so eloquently with, "Do we born with intelligent?" message, as an addendum, because I still find this story hilarious. The second sentence was, "How our cognitive is developed." One of my fellow PhD student marked an essay once which came in at 2 pages. It was a 6-page limit. And half of the essay, so 1 page, discussed Mowgli from the Disney animated version of the Jungle Book. The topic was developmental psychology. Story 11. I saw some amazingly bad attempts at plagiarism in my day. These included 1. Plagiarizing from an article in a journal the professor Tayed. This was a grad student. 2. Plagiarizing from the same source as another student in the same class. First hit on Google is not your friend. 3. Turning in a sophomore lit survey paper referring to a poet's use of hendecasyllabics. I have a doctoral degree, and I had to look that one up. Googled author's name plus hendecasyllabics. And there was the paper. Only thing the student contributed was her name. 4. When caught red-handed, insisting tearfully that she didn't plagiarize. Her roommate wrote the paper for her, and her roommate was the dirty plagiarist. I was literally speechless for a moment while I grappled with this line of reasoning. Bonus points. This was Ms. hendecasyllabics. Story 12. I once had a girl in my class ask why meteors always fall into craters. For context, this was journalism degree and we were talking about libel laws. This girl did not pass. Story 13. I'm not the professor, but I did talk to her about the student at the time. I was taking an online class. Each week we had to answer in a discussion board, in our own words, about whatever the topic was. The answers were all public to inspire discussion. I researched, took my time writing out the answers. Even though our names showed up, I still signed my name at the end of it. Usually an hour or two after I post my stuff, a classmate would post hers too. Without fail, she would copy and paste what I wrote and claimed it as her answer too. It was clear she never bothered to read it either because she kept my name at the end of it. After seeing this happen over 2 weeks, I emailed our professor and voiced my complaint. She emailed me back and said it's already been noticed by her. The following week, that classmate was no longer on the class roster. I was always curious who would pay that kind of money, just to steal answers and not bother to learn. She wasn't young either, we had profile pages. She was older than me by at least 20 years. It was just bizarre and dumb. Story 14. Actually one of the smarter kids in my class. Ethics. Awareness of social norms. Not so much. He sent me an email after the semester ended, asking if I'd mind telling my next semester class that his digital textbook was available for sale. Oh, and that it's a PDF. So if multiple people want it, he can sell them all copies. I responded that I admire his entrepreneurial spirit, but it probably wasn't a good idea to solicit his professor's help in starting a piracy-based book-selling business. Story 15. I was a student in this class, but after an entire chapter of going over the Civil War in a history class, our teacher as a joke said, "So who won the Civil War?" A girl raised her hand and said, "The South," and he laughed until he realized she was serious. And she tried to defend it, saying, "What? We still have slaves, right?" She was referring to still have mass slavery in the South. Story 16. History. Professor is talking about some expion or something and mentions Antarctica, is standing in front of a world map. Girl raises her hand, asks, "Excuse me, but where is Antarctica?" Professor stands there unable to answer for a few seconds, then raises his arm to the map and goes, "Right here," while running his hand under Antarctica and making exaggerated Vanna White motions. Girl goes, "Oh, okay." I was a little scared, more for the professor. He had that "I am severely underpaid" expression. Story 17. I teach a class on the history of psychology. When covering the chapter on behaviorism and discussing the ideas of its founder, John Watson, who was a determinist, did not believe in free will, a student asked me in the middle of class that if he was a determinist, why did he advocate free will in the Sherlock Holmes book? I was really taken aback by that one. Story 18. I wouldn't say dumb, but definitely baffling and annoying. She had somehow gotten all the way to college, still believing that weirdly and creepily exaggerated coy little girl flirting would get her what she wanted, including with female faculty. It was cringy to see in action, literally tilting her head to the side, playing with her hair, pivoting her leg back and forth, mannerisms, combined with semi-childish speech patterns while glancing up through her eyelashes. Definitely, I'm only talking to this one in front of witnesses territory. She told me that she was reading and studying every night, and still not making progress on tests and needed help. I explained how to make written study materials to help her absorb information better. She said she'd done that and reviewed the materials regularly, but still wasn't seeing results. Genuinely concerned and puzzled, I asked her to bring me her materials next class period and we'd go over them to make sure they were accurate and useful. She agreed. Next class period rolls around. She announces, with even more exaggerated mannerisms that wouldn't you know it, she was pronto-pron frustrated with her score on her last test, returned before our earlier conversation, that she'd thrown her study materials into the trash in a fit of anger, and they were all gone prawn, almost as if they had prawn ever existed. Prawn. I looked her in the eye and said, "I think you should consider then that self-discipline may be playing a role in your grades in my class." She huffed and pouted in outrage, and I never saw her again. What makes me sad is that clearly someone, almost certainly her family, had taught her that these behaviors worked. No one sticks to a behavior that strongly unless she has had success with it. Story 19. Had lots of students from Saudi Arabia. They typically pushed boundaries, so I learned quickly to set boundaries and be firm-fair with everyone in the class. One guy didn't see the need to come to class much or do homework, and his grades suffered greatly. He came in one day and said, "I want a better grade. My family is the XX." I don't remember the name, but apparently they were wealthy and well-respected. I didn't care, and I reminded him of his lack of effort. He was pissed, and he made some generic threats. but nothing specific I could call anyone about. I found out from the other Saudi students, most of which hated the guy, that he said duck it during the last week and went home without taking any finals. Maybe he was more arrogant, but I'd say he was also a dumbass. Story 20. Not a professor, but back when I was in high school. I was a library aide, and I was walking into classrooms distributing some books, and I walked into a class with the professor in the middle of an angry lecture on plagiarism because one of the students turned in an essay that started with, "In my 25-plus years of experience in this field." Story 21. Not my story, but in a test where you could bring solved questions with you, a student brought a question identical to the one the test paper has. Instead of just copying the answer and getting an AA, he glued the solution, which he brought with him with a glue stick. All he had to do is not being lazy. Story 22. We were discussing the three most common phases of matter: solids, liquids, and gases. Using water as the example, I asked a student to tell me what we call the solid phase of water. He replied, oil. I was dumbstruck, but mine was only temporary. Story 23. I am not a professor, but I watched one facepalm after my classmate said this. I don't even know what a verb is. This was in an advanced linguistics course for would-be English teachers. Story 24. I had a student who tried to argue that plagiarism wasn't real after ganking the text of a one-page paper on velociraptors straight from a top Google search result for them. But if you read something, then you're just taking the knowledge and thumping it back into a word processor. What's the difference? She was a criminal justice major. Story 25. High school teacher. Many years ago, I was showing my students clips from Romeo and Juliet. Student stared at the screen in total bewilderment for a few minutes. Then she said, serious as a cancer diagnosis, "How can he be in this movie? He died in Titanic. Why did my autocorrect change Romeo to Romero?" Story 26. A few years ago, I had a student turn in a term paper titled Mental Disorders. They then went on to misspell disorder 2 different ways in the first sentence. Ed for spelling. Story 27. The one who would regularly hand in essays which were obviously copy-pasted. They didn't bother to change the font or color of paragraphs that were lifted from other websites. They never argued or shared their opinion, but would ask vague questions such as, "But what is the United States?" at the end of a lecture or tutorial that was about a legal decision. Story 28. Not a professor, but a high school math teacher. I had a student who answered a FaceTime call during the final exam. I just took her phone, told the person on the other end, "Not a smart idea," and hung up on him. I let her continue the test. Then I caught her cheating off the guy next to her twice, so I failed her. And if that wasn't enough, during the next period's final exam, she burst into the room on her phone yelling, "Sup, Mr. Always Shamo?" I just yelled, "Go away!" And she left. Kid was so self-absorbed and clueless. Story 29. Not a professor, but in my AIT, MOS training, or your job for the Army, we had a guy get a -20 on a 100 PT grading scale for a simulated call for fire. Note, we were all becoming 13 Fs, forward observers. And this chuckle duck managed to miss 120 PTs on a 100 PT sim. He still ended up graduating. Story 30. I'm not a professor, but I studied modern languages at university and met a girl who had managed to spend an entire year abroad, a compulsory part of the course, living in the country where her language was spoken, working at a job with local people, and sharing a flat with 3 local people. And after the year was up, her language skills had not improved one jot, and her flatmates had to talk to her in English because she couldn't understand them otherwise. I mean, I fully appreciate that some people find it much harder than others to learn a foreign language. That's not actually the part I find dumb. The dumb part is getting into pound 30K of debt and spending 4 years of her life on a degree, then putting absolutely zero effort into actually learning the thing you're paying to learn. Actually, to be that bad at the language after a full year, you'd have to make an active effort to avoid it, never turn on a television or pick up a magazine. Spend all your time in English and Irish-themed pubs and ignore anyone who tried to talk to you. Story 31. Finally, a good one to speak to. There was this girl on the basketball team in college, just to set the stage. The assignment was for creative writing. 101 basically. Bring in an apple, write about it, place apple on the table with everyone else's apples, swap papers. Find the apple that goes with the vivid description on the paper. Dumb girl brought in a pear from the tree near the mailroom. Tried hard to convince me it was a crab apple and that they weren't edible. She even used pear-shaped to describe it. Her writing level was literally 2nd grade at most. Wasn't even ripe. Story 32. A student once threatened to sue me over the definition of the terms necessary and sufficient that he had mixed up in an exam. No biggie to mix them up. Actually, for a math major it might be, but loudly threatening to sue me over an age-old textbook definition in an exam review session was kind of stupid. It did entertain all other students who were present. Another student once requested letters of recommendation for 5 of the top 10 master's programs in Europe, while being the 2nd worst in his class of several hundred graduates. Story 33. Not a professor, but in my psychology class, There was this one girl that would ask questions every 3 minutes, not the good questions either, you know? Like the ones where the teacher didn't full-on explain things or anything that would make the discussion better, just the type of dumb questions where the teacher had literally said what she was asking about 2 minutes ago. Anyways, we were viewing a map of cultural stereotypes, and in Mexico it said maids and gardeners. Which, okay, fair enough, it's just a stereotype. But this girl legit looks at it, looks at the teacher and says, "That doesn't make any sense because Mexicans don't have gardens. How can they have gardeners?" As a student, I rolled my eyes. As a Mexican, I burst out laughing. JFC, I can't even be mad. I know she's not racist. She's just ignorant as hell. Story 34. My sister is a French teacher, not a professor, so I'm not sure if this counts, but here goes. Everyone in the class had a fairly lengthy piece of French homework, and one student put the entire thing in Google Translate, but translated it to Spanish. Story 35. Not a professor, and it didn't happen in college as well. But in my 4th year of high school, VWO for all the Dutch people here, a girl asked the teacher what Nazis were. Note that we had already discussed the Second World War in 2nd year of high school, and this is the Netherlands, where the Second World War is often discussed in all kind of schools during our Remembrance Day. Story 36. All she had to do to graduate was to show up to a seminar. I pointed out the importance of this as it was the last time this mandatory thing was being run, and the last chance for her, having missed earlier opportunities. And I wouldn't run the class next year. Got an email saying she had a dentist appointment and missed it. She failed, couldn't get her degree, and had to come back 18 months later for it. Story 37. I'm a high school teacher. And last year, I curated a class where the boy would put all the effort he could into studying, but he just didn't have it. Failed math exam 3 times. Story 38. I had a student when I was a TA who took the first quiz in my class, but I realized he wasn't on my roster. I told him this, but he insisted he was in my section. Soon, he stopped coming to section altogether, but did insist on handing his exams and papers back to me in lecture. I eventually discovered he was supposed to be in my colleague's class, but never attended that either. After the final exam, which he handed in to me, he admitted to me that he had just realized he was in the other class and had been confused because his roommate was in my class. But I guess it doesn't really matter since I didn't really show up anyway. Story 39. Not a professor, but in my statistics class, a girl asked if changing the minus to a plus would change the answer, not a negative to a positive. Like she wasn't questioning how negatives worked. She sincerely wanted to know if changing from subtraction to addition would change the answer. To the professor's CR, she answered with a kind yes and only a slight pause. Story 40. Dumb isn't the correct term. Ignorant is more apt, and one of my 17-year-old homeschooled students was so ignorant it was scary. He read at 2nd grade level and couldn't count past 20, and basic arithmetic non-existent. Forget writing, as his hand spelling was also at 2nd grade level. John's mother homeschooled him, and finally gave up on it at age 16, 17, and enrolling him in our high school. My other students hated this sad kid, and he was always in arguments with them. He threatened to kill one of his tormentors, and the guy laughed at him. I told this guy to cool it because, unlike many kids, John meant it when he said he'd kill him. Parents that elect to homeschool should be tested themselves, and periodic testing done on the student to see if they're progressing or not. Story 41. Not a professor, but I am in graduate school. We are in a hybrid program, which means we do part online and we go to class 5 Saturdays a semester. One guy came to the first class, then never came back until the last class. We were having a final that day, which he didn't know because our midterm was take-home. He slept through the final, even snored a few times, and almost fell out of his chair. I don't know why he even stayed. Story 42. Not a professor, but I worked at my university's tutoring center while in college. Had one student who was a sports science major and would come in for tutoring for every single class. He had to do this because he was barely literate, as in reading maybe on a 1st grade level. One of his assignments was to write about an important African American figure. He asked me what African American meant. The student was African American. For the record, I don't blame him for being dumb. I blame every single teacher he ever had whose responsibility it was to ensure that he was learning, and instead just passed him on so he would be someone else's problem. Upon rereading, I realized how harsh some of my comments sounded. For context, the school the student attended before college is known in my state for being terrible. Rough neighborhood, underfunded, less of a school-to-prison pipeline, and more of an express train. Also notorious for their poor staffing, mostly second-rate teachers who couldn't get hired anywhere else, or ones fresh out of college who quickly burn out and stop caring. I have the utmost respect for the hard-working, dedicated teachers who genuinely care about their students. You guys are heroes! Story 43. Had a single mom who came to class 3 times total. The last time was for the final. She leaned across the desk I was sitting at and asked me seductively if there was anything she could do to pass. I literally laughed and told her to get the duck away from me. Not only was she a fat slob, but she smelled like an ashtray and was one of the laziest students I'd ever had. She didn't even have a job. Still, she couldn't make it to class. We had free on-campus childcare FFs. She failed and lost her financial aid. Story 44. Not a professor, but I tutored athletes for $10 an hour at AD1 school. 2 stories, same guy. 1. What does colonialism mean? I tried to explain a concept spanning thousands of years of human history in a sentence. Double-checked with his athletic counselor. And yes, English is his first language. 2. What does delinquency mean? It's for his class called juvenile delinquency. We're 23 of the way through the semester. He's been taking this class for months now. Attendance is mandatory for athletes, so I know he's been to this class. The sad part is that he was a product of terrible public schools his whole life and was told since puberty, when he shot up to -7 if that as an athlete, school was optional. And damned if he didn't graduate with the same degree as me. We walked next to each other at graduation. Story 45. I taught calculus in college. There's always several students who are terrible lazy at the subject. But this term, there was one who was really energetic about appearing to put in the effort in multiple different ways. But I'll focus on one. I told the class I'd give them extra CR for doing any of the advanced problems at the end of the chapters. This guy turns in elegant, concise, handwritten solutions for all pron of them. That'd be hard even for me. He even knew how to do epsilon delta proofs. That's not something I taught. One of the problems involved a variable d and an epsilon delta argument. His proof contained the phrase, let epsilon d, which is utter nonsense, not only in context, but in terms of an epsilon delta proof in general. It's supposed to be let epsilon 0, without exception. He was copying from an instructor's solution manual without knowing the meaning of the symbols. I suppose this isn't dumb so much as shameless. Story 46. During an oral exam, basic engineering electronics, a girl could not answer a single question. So I ask her simpler questions. I bring close the oscilloscope and point at the power switch. It was pretty clear it was a switch as it was written in bold letters on-off. And ask her what was it? Answer, fuse. Story 47. I was an adjunct after undergrad and occasionally during my master's. I taught a few sections of pre-algebra which no one tenured wants to deal with. Me. I'm actually required to put one question of this type on the final. Him. There's a final? It was mid-November. Story 48. Not a professor, but I once dated a girl that was dumb. Sweet, naive, but I mean, she was straight up stupid. So naturally, we convinced her that cats couldn't see themselves, or other cats, in mirrors. Her cat was stupid too, and never looked at itself in the mirror, so it was a running joke between my friends and I for quite a while. We had been dating over a year and decided to take astronomy together. A few weeks into the semester, we broke up. A bad breakup at that. So one day, I'm sitting in the back. She's way up at the front, in an armistice of learning as we are separated as much as possible. The professor, unfortunately, is talking about advanced telescopes and loves her cats, and uses her cat as an example to look through one of these reflection telescopes to see another cat in a spaceship, or something like that. It was introductory, so she used these childish examples often. The whole class is pretty bored and lulled, but one little hand raises in the front row. I connect 2 and 2 and sort of slide down in my seat as I slowly realized what was going to happen. Cats can't see reflections, so your example won't work, a smug voice chimed in from the front. The professor stopped, not sure what just happened. Confusion at first, then she wasn't sure if it was some kind of prank. Once she realized my ex was serious, she snapped off something snarky and continued. My ex spoke up again, not to be dismissed, and the professor just rolled her eyes halfway through her sentence and asked, "What are they?" "Vampire cats." At this point, the entire class of 200 students is roaring laughing, so my ex stands up, gives me a glare that could melt stone, and stomped out of the class. Story 49, talking about Somali pirates. Student couldn't believe they wielded AK-47s and used pontoon boats. Thought they were the flagship and cannonball type straight from Pirates of the Caribbean. Story 50, not a professor. But back in 8th grade, we were discussing the war in Afghanistan because of a not dumb question another student asked, when another girl, the principal's niece, looks puzzled. She raises her hand, looks the teacher in the eye, and says, "I thought Afghanistan was a city in Vietnam same year. We were talking about plate tectonics and the creation of mountains and hills." Another girl stops our teacher dead in his tracks and says, "But God created the mountains." "You're a liar." Same class, our teacher was talking about his incredible life story being a single dad, then being in the Air Force and getting married to his high school sweetheart and having his second child nearly 20 years after his first. It was a truly great story until one of the remedial, slow-learning basic class kids literally shouts, "So you did it with her twice?" His sister looked at him with the most annoyed expression, and all she said was, "Well, yes, that's how he has 2 kids, and it was probably more than twice." Story 51? When my mom was a history teacher at a local high school, they went on a trip to Spain. One girl, let's call her Megan, was not quite a clever student. They went to a restaurant to eat, and Megan was looking at the menu. She was frowning the whole time and made some noises, and looked like she was struggling with the language. My mom told her there was an English menu on the other page, because she didn't understand Spanish. 3 minutes later, she still looked confused. My mom asked her what was wrong. Megan then asked my mom why the English language was so different than they learned at school. Megan didn't understand a word. My mom looked at her menu, went quiet for a second, and told Megan she was reading the German menu. Story 52. Not a professor, but I was helping out a younger friend's classmate revise for his O-level, 15, 16-year-old's maths exam. He had some past papers with him, so I looked through them and got him started with a simple problem to try and gauge how much he knew. The question provided some measurements in millimeters, asked you to do some basic number crunching, and finally provide the answer in meters. He attempted it for a few minutes, but didn't cover any ground, so he asked for help. I then went through the number crunching with him step by step and prompted him to do the final conversion to meters, thinking it would be trivial. He stared at me blankly. Me. How many millimeters are there in a meter? Student. I don't know. Me. What does milli mean? Student. I take out his foot ruler and place it in front of him. Me. Show me a millimeter on this ruler. No response. Me. What do the lines represent? He gives me some bullcrap answer that makes no sense. Me. Have you never used a ruler before? I then proceed to explain to him what the millimeter and centimeter marks on the ruler are. I also explain to him that they are 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, and 1100 of a meter respectively, and that the words milli and centi imply as much. Me. Okay, now that you know what these are and what proportion of a meter they are, can you show me how large a meter is approximately? I expected him to stretch his arms out and just say, about this much. Student. From here to nearby shopping mall? I just stared at him in disbelief. I was honestly shocked. The shopping mall he referred to was at least 2 kilometers away. His exam was in 3 days. How did he even make it this far in school? TL.R was helping a 15-year-old revise for his maths exam. He didn't know how to read his ruler, nor what a millimeter, centimeter, or meter meant. Story 53. Not a professor, but a student. First day of classes for college in my human development class. So, as usual, the teacher used the first day to go over the syllabus. He had it projected onto the screen and gave us all a copy of it to follow along, which is more than what professors usually did. Anyways, he was going over it in quite a bit of detail to make sure we all understood what was expected of this class. Every person in that classroom understood what he was saying, and how the syllabus worked except for this one lady. She was middle-aged, maybe a little older, and for whatever reason, she had a question about everything about the syllabus, asking a question after every point the teacher made. She would even ask a question after the teacher just went over what she was asking. He would comply to answer her questions. But even he was getting annoyed or would say that if she had a question to ask at the end of class. Everyone in the classroom was so annoyed by her that one of the students spoke up and said that she was wasting everyone else's time in class for asking questions that the professor literally had answered before she asked, or it's in the syllabus and she needs to read it before asking. The lady looked so surprised and offended and then looked at the teacher as if expecting him to say something. He just shrugged and said, "He's right," and went back to the syllabus. She shut up after that, and we never saw her after that first day. Now, I don't like to make assumptions that people are dumb because they just might be confused about something or have something going on. At the same time, though, how stupid can you be to just keep asking questions that are clearly being explained to you and then get offended when someone calls you out on it? Story 54. This happened in high school, senior year. Our teacher was talking about the phases of the moon, and this girl raised her hand and asked if other countries have moons too. She thought the moon was only for the US. Story 55. I'm a film student, and we were asked to make up our own 10 rules to follow when making a film, much like and specifically had us refer to us as a manifesto. This one student submitted the Communist Manifesto instead. According to my lecturer, that student didn't do very well, and is now a forklift operator. Story 56. This was just a one-time thing, because this kid is a pretty sharp student otherwise. I'm a flight instructor and was trying to teach my student how to find your ground speed while flying. To do this, you take 2 points, towns usually, that you know the distance between, and time how long it takes to fly between them. Okay, Bob, that took 7 minutes to fly between Bobsonville and Bobsville. The distance is 10 nautical miles. What is our ground speed? 5 inches, 5 what? 5 minutes. No, your speed. Yeah, 5 minutes. So since it took 7 minutes to fly 10 miles, then our speed is such that it took 5 minutes. Yeah. Story 57. Not a teacher, but this one made me feel bad for my philosophy professor in community college. My professor was a priest, very patient and easygoing guy. But this student really tested that. There was a woman who would sit in the front row and constantly fall asleep. When she wasn't asleep, she would argue with him about every major point. It was clear she was dumb as a brick, and she did it so often every time her voice piped up, the whole class would collectively do that silent groan and eye roll. She was a mom and rode horses, which she brought up quite frequently. My favorite is when the professor was talking about fulfillment and motivation in jobs with high pay but with unpleasant duties. His point was that while anyone could put up with an awful job for quite a while for good money, eventually the psychological toll would become too great and you would want to quit. She objects loudly and says if that's true, how come her horse does everything she wants it to and is happy with just an apple? She literally told the professor he was wrong because her horse likes apples. The professor at this point really didn't have much of a reply. I think he finally reached his limit. Everyone in class just kind of sat flabbergasted. I tried to explain the concept of it, but she just kept insisting it wasn't true because of her horse. Hands down, the worst classmate I've ever had the misfortune to have a class with. Every day was like that. Perhaps the professor thought a bit more about whether teaching was worth it after that day. A word. Story 58. Not a professor, but one of the students in a grad school seminar I was in was just, maybe dumb isn't the word, but this kid couldn't string two words together. We were all mystified at how he even got into the school, let alone the history program. The seminar would mix high-level undergrads with grad students, so not everyone was expected to be working on quite the same level. But this was ridiculous. It turned out that he had gotten into the university through some kind of science or engineering program at which he was prom-brilliant, like math scores off the charts, took organic chem for fun 6 times kind of brilliant, but he didn't want to go into that field. He really loved and wanted to go into history, so he transferred over. And no one thought too much about it because his science grades were so good. The poor kid bombed. He didn't have the vocabulary, syntax, critical thinking skills, analytical skills, creativity, nothing he needed to pass even a basic 101 history course, let alone a graduate-level seminar. The prof pulled me aside and asked me to help him. His paper before he turned it in. I kept a copy of it because its absolute gibberish was appalling. Everyone felt so bad for him because he wanted so badly to be there and just didn't have the brainpower to cut it. Last I heard, they had transferred him back to the science department and was doing well. I hope he's happy wherever he is. Story 59. Obligatory, not a professor here. But I remember one class we took an exam and were reviewing it after. Half of the class got one particular multiple choice question wrong. The question: name the 3 principles of sports media reporting. 4 choices. A had the first principle. B had the second. C had the third. And D was all of the above. Half of the class, in a college. Made me facepalm so hard I nearly broke my nose. Story 60. Obligatory. Not a professor, but an admin person at a university who handled things like petitions. Years ago, I worked at the faculty of pharmacy at a big Canadian university, and there was one student who petitioned everything. There was a running joke that the only way she would fail to graduate was if she failed to petition to graduate. She never did any work, never attended classes, was stupid, and would inevitably fail every course. She would then, of course, petition and would be given many more chances. As an example, they had to do a calculations test, which was just multiplication and division, but they had to get perfect on it. If they didn't, they had to keep taking the test until they got perfect. She, of course, did not get perfect. She got like 8 out of 10 and petitioned because 8 out of 10 is a passing grade, so she should be allowed to proceed. Expecting students to get perfect was an unfair and unrealistic expectation. The professor pointed out that if she had made one of those calculation errors on a person's medication, they would be dead, hence the need for perfection. She did that kind of thing all the time. It had to have been less work to just do the coursework than it was to file all of these petitions. To this day, I check the certificates on the walls of any pharmacy I go into to make sure it isn't her behind the counter. Story 61. I was not the professor, but perhaps the stupid student. I was taking a history class back in the mid-80s. As I was completing the final exam, multiple choice, answers on a Scantron answer sheet, I noticed all of my answers had a ghostly smudge beside them on the question sheet. Apparently, the professor took his old answer key and used whiteout to cover his tick marks beside the correct answers before making photocopies. I decided to leave one of the 50 answers incorrect for my personal edification. Story 62. So many to choose from, but I'll pick my favorites one. A student missed the first exam because her appendix had ruptured and she had to have surgery. She missed an exam later in the semester because her appendix had ruptured and she had to have surgery. When I asked how she had her appendix removed twice, I never heard from her again. 2. A student who was taking an online exam. They were essentially on the honor system to not cheat. Blackboard, the online learning system the course was given in, had frozen, so she wasn't able to complete the exam. To prove this, she took screenshots. Unfortunately, the screenshots also included all of her Google tabs with the questions searched. 3. I had a pair of students take online exams together. I caught their cheating due to the same odd answer on an open response question on the second exam. Turns out they had cheated on the first exam as well. On the first exam had the same sequence of letters as their answers. Student hash 2 submitted the answer to every question about 30 seconds after student hash 1. Unfortunately for student hash 2, The answers were given in a random order. So student hash 1 got an A on the first exam, and student hash 2 failed, at least until they were caught. Then I helped them get the same grade like they had planned. TL.1. Student had appendix removed twice. 2. Student sent me a screenshot of her cheating. 3. Student copied exam answers from another student, but failed to realize answers were given in random order. Story 63. Not a professor. Heard some arguing from the chemistry class with someone shouting, "But Mercury is a planet. How can there be 2 Mercuries?" Forgot the second part. Story 64. When I was working as a graduate assistant, the dean of the graduate school where I worked was reviewing the capstone projects of 2 police officers who were about to graduate with master's degrees in criminal justice. She quickly discovered that they had plagiarized. She figured this out because when she opened the electronic dough ejaculate, or cum, seminence, there was a significant amount of text that was hyperlinked. The links brought her to Wikipedia. Story 65. I'm not a professor, but a brother in my fraternity won the most likely to be serving fries at McDonald's superlative at the end of the year. He genuinely thought he earned the award because he liked French fries so much. Story 66. Not a professor, but a ta. I don't think I ever had genuinely dumb students. It's just that some people adjust more easily when moving from high school to university than others. In particular, if you were naturally smart, you could just coast through high school. Material was presented slowly and frequently enough that missing a class here or there didn't really matter. Not so in university. For a Physics 101 lab course for pre-med students, this one student regularly came 45 minutes late to a 2-hour lab, so he'd miss the discussion at the beginning of the lab session where I discussed the task at hand and common pitfalls to avoid. Then he'd wonder why he wasn't able to finish on time and why he struggled figuring out why his lab experiment didn't turn out the way he expected. Story 67. I'm not a professor, but the dumbest, weirdest thing I ever witnessed in college was a student who had to do a presentation on objectivity in science reporting. A project she had voluntarily chosen, might I add. She had been provided with reading material by the professor a few weeks in advance. On the day of the presentation, she walked in front of the class, unpacked her things, seemed to be preparing, then sat down in front of us and proceeded to do absolutely nothing. After a few moments of silence, the professor asked what the problem was, and she said, "The texts were in English. I only speak German," followed by her continuing to just sit there and do nothing. I'm not sure why she bothered to position herself in front of us, knowing that she didn't have anything to present anyway, nor do I know why she didn't inform the professor of the language barrier, let alone why she had signed up for a course that worked prone exclusively with English material prawn in the first place. I do know, however, that it took a few more minutes of her just sitting there quietly before the professor told her to go back to her seat. Story 68. Not one particular student, but I've encountered this several times this year, and I don't understand it. In 2 of my music education methods courses, I require students to put together a resource notebook, which includes a study guide. This is meant to help them remember the technical aspects of teaching different instruments, for example, woodwinds. They are allowed to use the completed study guide for all quizzes and written exams, but they may not use their textbooks on these tests. I'm essentially giving you a cheat sheet to use. The reason being, writing down the information helps you to retain it, and the test doesn't just regurgitate the study guide, but you have to apply the techniques from the study guide. Each semester, I have about a quarter of the class who refuses to do the study guides. People who do the study guides make a B+ or better, usually an A. People who don't almost invariably fail. It's too much information to try to memorize, so bring the damn study guide and write about how to apply the information. But I guess that's too much trouble. Story 69. Not a teacher, but one of my friends, on a geography test with one of those blinded maps. Test. What is the capital of Australia? Him. Paris, he got a 0, even though the minimum was a 1. Story 70. I'm not a teacher, but my dad is a college professor, and he often has pretty funny tales. However, this last semester of psychology and sports students have been a whole new level of dumb. He showed them how to use APA, then Prony did it for them. Pron for the different chapters of the book. All they had to do was Pron literally copy and paste Pron the reference he made for the chapter they used. Dummy proof, you would think. Right? Wrong. Prawn pronoun student copied the wrong chapters. Prawn. Prawn pronoun student copied all of the references. Prawn. Prawn pronoun student made changes to the references. Prawn, that one. I saw big red question marks beside, and he noted, "I did it for you." Why would you change it to be wrong? E. Story 71. I'm not a professor, but I did grade exams, homework, mainly worksheets, and some papers for a few professors back in college. Hands down, the dumbest student I ever saw was one who turned in a photocopy of his friend's homework. Yes, a straight-up, minimally .dead Xerox. He had made the tiniest effort to trace over the first few answers in pen, but had stopped well before the end of the first page of a 5+ page worksheet. The best part was that his friend's name was still clearly visible on the first page of the worksheet. This guy hadn't even bothered to obscure it. He just put a single line through it and wrote his own name next to it. Forgot to add that the original homework wasn't complete, so the copy artist wouldn't have passed, even if he hadn't been caught. Story 72. The student that decided to plagiarize his entire 5-page paper. First, the whole class had been working on this paper for the entire semester, the only paper due. We had library days on how cite things and find the information you needed, and they were going to be turning it in through an online paper checker that would give them feedback on plagiarism. They could revise and resubmit the paper as many times as they wanted, and this dip crap turned it in with every single thing but his name highlighted in neon colors. He then had the balls to say he didn't do anything wrong and trashed my desk because he failed. Story 73? Not a prof, but in my first year in a class with 300+ students, we had an assignment called Peer Scholar. We had to write about a short, maybe 1,000-word argument for against legalizing weed. Then you would look at 5 other people's work and give them feedback. And 5 people would look at your work and give them feedback. You were also graded based on how good your feedback was. One person's argument was hilarious. I have a screenshot somewhere in the depths of my Gallardo account. But one paragraph. His argument was talking about how the economy would collapse from weed becoming legal, because everyone would be so high all the time they couldn't work. I'm pretty sure he just wrote some last-minute crap essay to get some marks since the final draft has the most marks, but it was so hilariously bad. Story 74. I'm currently a student, but I honestly cried when I heard my professor tell us this. My professor in statistics handed us a paper cheat sheet of how we can input data, organize it from smallest to largest, find the mean, median, mode, etc. on TIE 84 calculators. The first step on the paper said, make sure the calculator is turned on. Press the on button on the corner of the calculator. A student raised his hand and said, why did you need to tell us how to turn it on? To which my professor said, I had a student a few years ago that was getting angry on the test because he was pressing the numbers and buttons on the calculator, but nothing was coming onto the screen. I walked over to him, and after checking to see if the batteries were working in his calculator, he didn't realize that you had to turn the calculator on before you could do anything with it. He honestly didn't know where the on button was either, and that's why he made a new cheat sheet for his later classes and decided to add the turn on calc part as the first step. Story 75. I taught an intro astronomy lab course as a grad student. I had a student one semester who was just plain not very smart. There was a question on the first homework assignment, which covered elementary concepts in physics, which asked why an aircraft carrier floats. His response was that its wings kept it from sinking. The kid struggled for most of the semester. He showed up and did his work, but was so obviously lost that it was kind of sad. Then one day, after explaining the structure of the galaxy to him for like the 100th freaking time, he had what I can only describe as a short circuit. All of a sudden, his eyes got huge and you could see it just suddenly click. He spent the rest of the lab excitedly explaining to everyone that couldn't get away fast enough how massively big the galaxy was. Next thing I know, he's coming to class early and staying after to ask questions. Ended up with a B in the class and was one of my favorite students. Story 76. I'm not a professor, but my roommate freshman year of college was pretty dumb. We were at a private liberal arts university, and a part of our Frosh seminar class was attending one of the dean's lectures and writing a paper about it. It was a gimme A. She decided not to attend any of the dean's lectures. They posted the videos of the lectures online, and people who didn't physically attend could watch one and write the paper for 90% CR or so. She elected not to watch anything, just pick a title of one and write about it. The title of the lecture she picked was The Value of a Liberal Arts Education. She wrote about the value of a liberal education, as in liberal versus conservative, and was so pissed when she got an F on the paper and completely couldn't understand why. I don't think she ever did. Story 77. I'm late and not a professor, but I share this one any chance I get. 10th grade. I had a girl in my class ask the teacher how long it would take for a submarine to travel from the Florida to California going underneath the country. Story 78. My mom isn't a professor, but she sometimes supervises college students who study under her in a practi-ejaculate or semen setting. She was on a home visit with a student once. She's a social worker. And the family was showing my mom and the student around their farm. The matriarch of the family was gathering chicken eggs and commented on how small some of them were. The student suggested placing them back in the hen's nest so that they would have more time to grow. This senior in college thought that eggs grow bigger the longer they can remain in the nest, like vegetables or something. This is also in a very rural place where probably half the population has some kind of farm or livestock. Story 79. A few semesters ago, I had 2 students in a statistics course not know how to do division using a calculator. They didn't know what order to press the buttons in. Story 80. Not a prof, but we had a creative writing assignment where we were given a piece of paper with a list of 5 unusual words to use in a poem. I read my poem, which used all the words, and a girl went on an angry rant over the fact that I had used a bunch of obscure words that she didn't understand. Story 81. Not a professor. In the midst of an English Renaissance literature course, one of my fellow students raised her hand. Dr. Professor? I am just so like, how did these people survive without Wally World? She meant Walmart. She wanted to know how Renaissance-era people survived without Walmart. Our professor stared at her for a couple seconds, and then moved on with his lecture as if he hadn't heard. Story 82. In my second year of a bachelor's in Spanish, I tutored a sweet but clueless third-year Spanish major. She had studied for a summer in Spain and was taking 300 and 400 level, junior and senior level courses. That's about approximately 7 years of classes up to that point. One day of tutoring, I was explaining the Spanish and Portuguese colonization of the Americas. She looks at me confused and asked for clarification. I referenced a map showing their routes to Central and South America. Then she hit me with the best, worst question I have ever been asked. Why would they need to sail across the Atlantic if Spain is here? Pointing to modern-day Colombia. Whoa, buddy. Story 83. Not a professor, but a fellow classmates of mine, was in my chemistry course. They would go on rants about energies. I was very confused as I tried to deduce what energies they meant: kinetic, thermal, etc. Turns out they are believe in some magic spirits, despite majoring in sciences. A word English isn't my best subject. Story 84. Not a professor, but I used to for a postgraduate ethics and accounting course. I once received a paper that was literally a cut and paste of a Wikipedia article. I figured this out by the fact that they didn't remove the footnote markers, so there were a bunch of blue numbers and pronunciation needed prawn marks throughout the paper. He protested the 0 he received loudly in front of the entire class, so I pulled up the Wikipedia page on the projector and just started reading his paper. Story 85. You're asking me to pick just one? I routinely get people in 300-level history classes who think the Civil War was in the 1940s. About a quarter of them can't tell me the dates of the American Revolution, WI, WEE, or the Vietnam War. This is after having gone through 2 semesters of American history. There was a guy who thought Hitler killed MLK, but there was also the girl who thought the American Revolution started December 17th, 1941, or the girl who thought Uncle Sam, the cartoon character, was in charge of Union troops in the Civil War, or the guy who thought the Vietnam War was fought between the North and the South, U.S. Story 86. Not a professor. But back when I took driver's ed, the teacher asked if anyone knew what the raised bumps between lanes were in the roads. A guy raised his hand, was called on, and said in all seriousness, "For blind people, so they stay in their lane." Everyone turned and stared at him in silence. The teacher had this look on his face like, "Da duck?" Then everyone started laughing, and his buddy next to him whacked him in the arm like, "You're joking?" But he just turned to his friend with his hands like so the teacher set him straight. He never raised his hand in class again. Story 87. Not a professor, but during orientation, someone mentioned the writing assignment that was due for students in a specific first-year program. One guy asked, genuinely, "Hey, do we really have to write that paper, or can we have someone write that for us?" The leader responded, "You have to write the paper." "Ugh. Why would I do that? I have the money to just pay some guy. That's what I did in high school." Psh! He was 100% serious. Story 88. I heard this story from my professor dad. Once, during the week of a final paper, he found an office voicemail from a student claiming it was midnight and he has to drive 2 hours to a major city because his friend needed emergency appendectomy surgery. The student forgot that in those days, voicemails spoke the recording time, which was 7:30 a.m. Story 89. As a student in a class, this girl, who somehow managed to be tertiary, would ask an average of 20 questions per 40-minute session. Since we knew the statistics final would be a project, my friend and I recorded the number of questions she asked compared to the rest of the class. It came out that on average, she asked at least 3x as many questions as the class on average. The girl was supremely stupid and didn't understand why the probability of rolling a 6 on a die was 16. Story 90. I once gave a university student a C on a philosophy paper. She looked at me and said, "Do you know who my father is?" To this day, I don't know who he was, but her grade did not change. Story 91. I'm not a professor, but I was a TA for a first-year computer science class. When I was grading some assignments, I saw that the student submitted the file with only the name changed and didn't bother to look over the assignment at all. The assignment was the same as the previous years, but the test variables were changed to different values, and this student didn't even bother to do that, and just assumed the assignment was the exact same. Story 92. A friend was substitute teaching a high school math class and was to proctor a test for the students. At one point during the test, a student got up to ask if he knew what 8x7 was. But before he could respond, another student said, "Sit down. He doesn't know the answer to that. He's a substitute teacher, not a math teacher." Story 93. I'm currently in a certification program for baking and pastry. Last fall, I was taking a cake decorating class, and one of our assignments was to visit a bakery. Try one or more of their baked goods and write your experience about the visit. It was literally you. Writing your own Yelp review. That's it. No word count or anything. Just a review. One of the guys in my class plagiarized a review he found online.